All right, I think we're all back. All right. So, who wants to share what was discussed in your breakout rooms? Any points of emphasis? Any interesting commentary you guys want to share? So there was three questions on the table. How would you define MAAT? How does this reading relate to last week's reading? And what questions do you have about the reading? So any of that was supposed to be discussed in the past 10 minutes. Um, Share. Go ahead, Brianna. You don't have to raise your hand. Just speak out.
Oh, well, we talked about how the readings are related from last week because of how they define what is good and bad for the people. Because they just listed for the first one, they listed like what people should do, and then for the second one, they mentioned the Declaration of Innocence for the people. So we just kind of connected the two.
Absolutely. That's a really good connection. Who else
Um,
wants to share? Go ahead.
I got you. Well, what I got from the reading was that the principles of Ma'at, the truth, balance, order, harmony, and righteousness, and all that, it gave them their moral compass. It gave them it was like the embodiment of like their personification of truth.
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. Who else wants to share?
I do. So similar to what Brianna said, talking about how it relates to the last week's reading, I said by their ideal way of living, sort of. And in this week's reading, they explained it as the moral starting point.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So I think you guys are all right. You're topping on like this is like the moral compass of the ancient Kemetic society, right? What questions were posed in the breakout rooms? So you all understood the reading absolutely. There was no questions about the reading.
I guess I'll share since I haven't had the chance. I also wanted to add that I think it's important to kind of first understand that MAAT has like an ethical implication as well as like having yeah, sorry, give me a second. It has an ethical and ontological implication. So I think it's important to kind of understand that not only like you have to kind of understand how it's said in the reading, like the viewpoint of it. So, there's not like an equation like, oh, you guys have to like you have to do ethics and ontology to like make sense of math. Like you could kind of just they go both they interject together.
Yeah.
So it's very important to understand the viewpoint of it first for me.
Yeah. That's a really good point, Jesse. Um, does everyone understand what ontology is? Because I mean that's a very core component of the readings. Did anyone question what this idea or this notion or this terminology ontology is? So everybody understands ontology then? Okay, cool. Um, so Dulce says somebody explain what ontology is for Dulce and Jaden. So for those who said they did understand ontology, right? I'm asking you to explain it to Dulce and Jaden who don't understand what ontology is.
I'll go ahead. For me, what I kind of looked upon on ontology is kind of the creation of like the base the create. It takes like the concepts of creation, like of nature. So kind of like the universe, the cosmics, kind of the fundamentals, kind of like the origin,
Yeah.
I think.
And really, let's look at the chat. The relation between the concepts and categories of a subject. So another way, right, to understand what's put in the chat, which is correct, you guys are both right, but it's also understanding how one understands themselves, right? So when you talk about a subject, the subject can be you. Your ontology allows you to come to the understanding of who you are, right? So if I were to look at myself, me as a man, manliness has a specified ontology, right? Me as a black man has a specified ontology. So all of the ways that society understands blackness to be is part of my ontological understanding of myself as a black man, right? So that's how a way to understand or to situate this idea or this notion of ontology. So let's do this. Let's jump into my notes. The book is titled MAAT, the moral ideal in ancient Egypt. And if you look right here, they're actually holding an image of Ma'at. That's her with the feathers on her head holding the Ankh. The author of the text is Maulana Karenga. He is the chair of the Afrikan Studies Department at Cal State Long Beach. He's also the creator of the holiday Kwanzaa, and he is a central head in the US organization, which in the 1960s was a rival organization to the Black Panther Party. And we'll get into that a little bit as we get further on into the semester. But this notion, this idea of Ma'at, right, to get into my notes. And I'll read. Looking at page 5 in the opening paragraph, towards the middle of the paragraph, I'm going to read this whole section for two reasons. One, it gives us a great understanding of what Karenga is up to. Also, it gives you some insight into academic writing, but I also want to kind of break down on how to understand the way that this is written, okay? So I'm going to start with the sentence that says Ma'at, however, comma. So Ma'at, however, is highly polyseismic and apt to strike one unfamiliar with the conceptual elasticity of such ancient and central themes as lacking categorical preciseness and thus analytical utility, right? So this is what we would call a counter argument, right? So just to break it down, it says Ma'at has various different meanings and understandings, right? And if you're not familiar with the conceptual elasticity, if you're not familiar with the ways that Ma'at can shape, move, and be morphed, right? You may think that this notion of Ma'at is lacking categorical preciseness, so it's not precise to fit in any category, and thus analytical utility. So because it's not categorically precise, there has no real use in the systems of trying to analyze something, right? This is the counter argument. Then Karenga gets into his real argument. Actually, comma, this conceptual elasticity, which at first glance might seem problematic, on deeper inquiry proves promising due to what Morin's, so we know that Morin's is the author, that's his last name. We have the parentheses, 1984, that's the year that his book was published, comma, the 16, which is the page that this passage is found on, okay? And then we know with the quotation marks, that is what Morin says, right? So Morin's calls Ma'at a rich treasury of meaning, okay? For here, one encounters in Ma'at with Kua, another author, 1978 is the year of publication, 138 is the page. And this is what Kua defines as plural designation, which allows for and encourages a wide range of thought and interpretations, right? So he's recognizing that this notion of Ma'at allows for and encourages a wide range of thoughts and interpretations. Moreover, within the framework of a monotheistic ontology, which, as another author, Feinstadt, 1985, 1986, 1989, notes, is central to the Kemetic worldview, the conceptual elasticity of Ma'at as a category of interrelated, ethical, social, religious, political, and or natural order significance proves invaluable, right? So really all of that is saying, right? One may think because of the elasticity of this concept of Ma'at is not useful for a point of analysis, right? When in fact it's this elasticity that becomes very generative in understanding what this Kemetic concept of Ma'at is, right? Because to understand this, You have to know that it's interrelated within the ethical, the social, the religious, the political, and the natural order of things, right? So if you don't understand the elasticity of this notion of ma'at, then you're not going to understand it, period. What is elasticity? What does that mean? What is
The ability to bounce back.
Right. To bounce back, to be shaped, moved, pulled.
Also, this, well, in this context of elasticity, I feel like it like can be perceived in many ways and in very, very different mindsets and points of view.
Absolutely. That's exactly what they're referring to. So what Karenga is arguing is how this elasticity of this concept is extremely important, right? And you cannot understand this without knowing that this is a concept that can be altered and manipulated, right? So then he gets into how this concept has evolved over time, right? And I'm looking at page 6, the opening full paragraph. The etymology of ma'at. Who knows what etymology is? What is etymology when you hear that term? What does that refer to?
The history of words.
Boom, perfect. The history of the word, right? The origin of the word. The etymology of the ma'at suggests an evolution, right? So it changed from a physical concept of straightness, evenness, levelness, correctness, right? So think about a ruler, right? What does a ruler do? It makes sure that you draw a straight line, right? Think about a leveler. What does a leveler do? When you hang up a picture, they want to make sure that that picture's straight, right? So there's a physical concept of levelness, of straightness, right? This is how ma'at originated, right? And this was embodied as the wedge-shaped glyph or hieroglyph to suggest to a general concept. So it goes from this physical concept, thinking of a ruler or a level, right, to a more general concept of rightness, including the ontological and ethical sense of truth, justice, righteousness, order, in a word, the rightness of things, right? So just as a ruler and a leveler is going to make sure, as a tool, will make sure things are done correctly, right? Ma'at, as a general sense, is used to make sure that things are done correctly, right? So you want to make sure that your behavior is ma'atic. You want to make sure that your speech is ma'atic, right? Done in a way that's correct, done in a way that's right, okay? So now we know the evolution of this term ma'at. So the ecological notion of ma'at, right? So not only is ma'at concerned with justice, right? It's making sure that things are done in a way that's fair to everyone, that's just to everyone. It abhors, it has a great disdain, it disavows this notion of injustice, right? So think from a political standpoint, if you have a organization, a political system that is not only predicated on justice, but it abhors, it disdains, it disavows injustice, that wouldn't work in our society today, right? Because we are so complacent with injustice, we're so comfortable with injustice, we're almost implicit with injustice, right? We see things unjust happen all the time, and we call that politics, right? But in a Ma'atan society, not only are you to be just, you must do away with all things. You must combat all things that prove to be unjust, right? So they're taking it up a notch. There's also 4 domains that the author articulates that Ma'at is useful in. The universal domain, the political domain, the social domain, and finally the personal domain. And again, think of these domains as separate, but they're interrelated, okay? So for the universal domain in which Ma'at is the totality of ordered existence and represents things in harmony and in place. So from a universal standpoint, Ma'at represents everything within the universe being in order. being in harmony, being set in the proper place, right? From a universal standpoint. From a political domain, echoing what I was saying earlier, the political domain in which Ma'at is justice and in opposition to injustice. Again, opposition. I oppose injustice. That's how the political domain works. 3, the social domain, in which the focus is on right relations and duty in the context of community. Again, this notion of relations, right? Think about last week's reading. Ptah Hotep wanted to instill the Meter Nefer, right? Good speech, to ensure that strife is eliminated throughout the society, right? And I equated that to this idea or this notion of relations, how we relate to one another. This is also a concern of Ma'at from the social, domain, right? And the fourth and final one, the personal domain, in which the following rules and principles of Ma'at is to realize concretely the universal order in oneself, to live in harmony with the ordered whole. So think about the universal domain, right? Everything in the universe ordered and structured in a fashion that is the way it's supposed to be, right? So they're saying in the personal, your personal life should be ordered, structured, and fashioned in a way that it's supposed to be. So these are the 4 domains in which Ma'at operates: the universal, the political, the social, and the personal. But these are all interrelated, okay? I'm gonna skip past that one. And then it also talks about this idea of personal consciousness and personal responsibility, right? But this personal consciousness is a community understood consciousness, right? So I cannot say that, oh, I feel I'm a good person because I do what's right, right? You all have to come into agreement because we as a community have to share this understanding of what's right. So if I say that I'm living a way that's ma'atic and you guys feel otherwise, then that's not a ma'atic because you don't agree with my understanding of good, right? Because you say that, you know what, your behavior, the way that you talk to us is out of alignment with ma'atan principles, right? Regardless of what I think I'm doing, it has to be aligned with the society, right? And I'll parallel this as we move into next week and we start to read about West African pre-colonial societies, this idea of manhood. Manhood is not an individual owned notion, right? So I cannot say because I have genitalia, right? Because I have hair on my face, I have a deep voice, right? That I'm a man. Because I have kids, I have a man. No, that's not how manhood works in pre-colonial West Africa. There's a criteria that must be in place, right? The first thing that you must do is boyhood rites of passage. So from the ages of 9 through 12, you're going through a rites of passage, right? That's one criteria. The second criteria is at your teenage level, you must demonstrate physical prowess, right? That may be going to war. That may be going to hunt a lion, right? That may be doing something physical that demonstrates your physical prowess. That's your second step. Your third step is husbandhood, right? Having the abilities and the mental intelligence to have a wife, right? And your fourth and final step is fatherhood. So if you have not met those 4 criterias, that community would not consider you a man, right? So manhood is not an individual-owned concept, it's a community-owned concept. Just as ma'at and living a life that's ma'atic is not to be determined by the individual, it's to be determined by the society, determined by the collective whole, right? So this notion of ma'at is a collective notion, a societal collective notion, right? So this becomes important. And I'll read this last one and I'll finish it with this. So I'm looking at page 10, the opening paragraph of page 10. The key point of this discussion, then, is that the practice of ma'at is conceived and carried out within the worldview which links the divine, the natural, and the social, right? Remember, we talked about that interrelatedness. So we're going to link the divine, how you guys understand what God is, right? The natural, nature, the nature, and the social, society, right? So Ma'at is conceived and carried out within the worldview which links the divine, the natural, and the social. These three domains are interrelated, interactive, and mutually affective, not effective with an E, but affective with an A. And a Ma'atan person understands this and acts accordingly, as the history of the idea of Ma'at, which is presented below, demonstrates, right? So again, we must think about the divine, the natural, and the social as interrelated entities, right? In your understanding of Ma'at and Ma'at's elasticity. So those are my notes for the reading. We'll jump into our fishbowl. For your fishbowl, you can pull from my notes. You could pull from your breakout room conversation. You can literally read from your journal. All that is permissible. Is there anybody who wants to volunteer? Jaden, got you. We'll go for 4. Anyone else want to volunteer before I start calling at random? All right. Maria, are you willing to fishbowl today? Maria Munoz. Munez, is it? Perez Munez? Okay, thank you, Maria. Wait, people who... I'll give you one second. I'm looking at the chat. The people who did it last time. To answer your question, Brianna, yes and no, right? So you are good, but you are supposed to do 2 a semester. So you have 1 knocked out, but is there 1 more expected of you? But you don't have to go today. And I got you also. Okay, we're looking for 1 more. Is there anyone else who wants to volunteer? If not, I'll call on someone.
I got you.
Okay. And then
It's the reading. The
but,
Ma'at?
Yeah, it's going to be on the MAAT reading. Yep.
Okay.
All right. So, Carlos, your hand is raised. Do you have a question, or did you want to volunteer for the fishbowl?
Yeah, I wanted to volunteer.
Okay, we can squeeze you in. We can do 4. I mean, sorry, 5. So we have Jaden, Maria. Is it Ashlan? Is that how you pronounce that? And then Kine, Carlos. All right, I'm gonna put myself on pause. Whoever wants to set it off, it's on you.
All right. I wanted to start off by asking, because a lot of the reading, especially in this week, there's a lot of parallels, especially with last week's reading, in terms of the way, I guess, in terms of personal domain, at least, and the ways in which I guess the teachings of Ptahhotep, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, is I guess conveying how people are essentially supposed to live, kind of going back to that Bible comparison in the sense of basic instructions before leaving Earth. So I wanted to ask if there was any specifically that you guys thought, at least in modern society and today, what that would make I guess the world a better place in terms of the way that we compare society back then and society now, or even the opposite in terms of what do you think would work and what do you think would basically bring chaos depending on the time periods.
So Jaden, I'm going to restate the question just to make sure everybody understood it correctly, and I think it's a great question to pose to the class. So essentially, if I understand correctly, what you're asking, what principles, what confessions, what characteristics of Ma'at that would be useful for society today, and then what principles, characteristics, or practices of Ma'at that would be damaging in our society today. Is that essentially what you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that's a good question. If anybody wants to open up and address that, go ahead and please do. I think that's a great point of conversation.
Yeah, I'll respond to that. Also, I'm a little sick, so pardon me.
No worries.
But I was just thinking, it's like this whole concept of like, moral, like, guidelines for justice and order. I've always thought that this is like super subjective, like in any religion, and it's kind of hard to apply that now, especially because the world is so much more globalized. Because back in ancient Egypt, it's like each society was like super isolated, right? And and I feel like they each had their own distinct way of living their lives. But now that we have people from like all over the world, right? Like, in America especially, it's like we have so many people from different walks of life. And I feel like it's kind of hard to apply such a concept to a country like this where it's like a melting pot, as people say. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I agree with you, Roland, and I think it was also kind of mentioned in the last class. It would be difficult to apply a lot of these concepts, just because the morals and the values of this society are so off kilter from what MAAT is talking about. I think that would be the bigger detriment opposed to the melting potness of American society, because if you really study the history of ancient Kemet, it was a melting pot society, right? You had people coming in from the Asian continent. You had people coming in from the Arabs coming into that area. You had Europeans coming into that area. So really, MAAT was and very much operated as a melting pot, as a confluation of various cultures, right? I'm sorry, Kemet. But all of those who migrated to that land were forced to operate under these premises of MAAT, because that was the societal tone of the nation, right? Just like, for example, although we are a multi-ethnic, we are a melting pot society, right? There's characteristics that we all abide by here in this society. We're a capitalist society, so everyone, whether you agree with it or not, is going to participate in some form or another in capitalism, right? We're a materialistic society, so whether you agree with that or not, at some form or another, you're participating in some aspect of materialism, right? So things like that are really hard to avoid when it comes to societal ethos, right? Regardless of you being a multiracial or melting pot society or not. Real quick, I see your hand up, Tiana. We're going to get to that, but I just want to make sure, Jaden, did you finish what you wanted to say for your fishbowl?
For the question, yeah, that's
Okay.
that's essentially what I want to ask.
Okay, perfect. So Tanaya, did you want to comment on that?
It was kind of like two parts.
Okay.
So in response to what he was saying, and it like I had already written that comment before he asked his question. It was kind of like, I feel like in this reading, first off, it was pretty thick. It has to be read a couple times, but there can be made like a lot of connections, not only to religion, but just the different ways of being in society. And even though we don't want to make those connections, like how it will be in MAAT society, how conforming is what we would call it, is like negative. But for that society, it was the most positive way of living and having people be one with each other.
Yeah.
People being in one, agreement, like, okay, this is a good person, not, 50% think he's good, 50% think he's bad, so I guess he's kind of good. Like, no, it's either all or nothing. And I don't know. I think that can definitely be incorporated in society to answer his question. Just being in complete or close to complete agreement instead of being fine with always having like opposition to things, especially important matters. And then the second part was when you were speaking about like people that migrated from Asia to Egypt. It at what point in like history? Because you said that Africans were the first people. So did like people migrate to Asia and then like some just came back, or how did that work?
So a couple things. One, where I'm pulling that from. I'm gonna put you on pause. On mute, for feedback. Okay. So this text is called "The Destruction of Black Civilization" by Chancellor Williams. And what he essentially, the thesis of this text is how, essentially, what the title ensues, right? How this ancient African civilization we know as Kemet was eroded and destroyed, right? And it's a process that happened over several centuries. So there was a point where it was just African people on the planet. If we think back to that lecture where I'm talking about African people being traced 8 million years old, right? I believe it was 320,000 years when they made their migration outside of Africa, right? And in doing so, not everyone made it back, and your phenotype begins to change, and you get these ethnicities that we call Europeans, that we call Asians, et cetera, et cetera. Then they make their way back into Africa, because according to Chancellor Williams, at the time, the ecology of Kemet was the highest, right? Because of where it was situated on the water, because of not being so hot, not being too cold. This drew a lot of people to migrate to Kemet because of the culture in Kemetic society, right? People wanted to be part and take part of that culture. So these are some of the forces that drew non-Africans to Kemet. But with them drawing non-Africans to Kemet, these tensions start to arise, and we have cultural rifts that take place. And just as humans do, right, they start jockeying for power, and that starts the forced migrations of Africans out of Kemet, further south and further west into the western parts of Africa. But if you want to get a real comprehensive understanding of that, The Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams is a great place to start. So if you could jump back into our fishbowl, we have Maria, we have Ashlan, we have Kine, and Carlos, who also need to go.
Well, I guess add on to our point about the where our society is compared to Kemet with the MAAT, and how we all, like, I guess over here in our modern day society here in America, we all want to not conform. The idea of the connotation of the word conform to be the same, I guess, is seen as a bad thing, such as like when it could be seen as a beautiful thing, such as unity, I guess. So I guess by that same logic, we would not. I don't know. It seems counterproductive that we don't like the idea of conforming, because conforming can also be unity. And then the comparison of Ma'at and the idea of everyone being together, that togetherness, that all values, sharing this equal values builds connection. So I feel if we had that here in our society, there'd be a little less hate and a little bit more. But I don't know, everyone's too concerned with trying to be different at all the wrong times. Like, I don't know. It's just more, I don't know. It was a good point, and I wanted to bring it up. Yeah.
I agree. And I think that's also kind of echoed earlier in our conversation. We were talking about the interrelatedness of the different domains, how that can bring harmony. So I think that's also a great point. Yeah, I'm just looking at the chat. Tonight, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of, there's Asians who are darker than me, right? That's historical fact. People don't want to cop to that. But we still have two more people who need to comment actually three more people who need to comment for their fishbowl.
Yeah, I would go. I just really like the teachings of MAAT. That's how you say it, right?
MAAT.
Yeah, I just really like the teachings, and I like how it offers several principles, about truth, balance, order, harmony, and a bunch of other stuff. And I feel like if I apply this into my life, it will make me as a better person, and it's just gonna really guide me,
Yeah.
And I just like how it passes down wisdom, and it's gonna help me make the right decisions.
Yeah, so Carlos, you really took this from the personal domain, and you've seen the ways that it can really inform your life and inform your decision making. So I think that's brilliant, man. So we have two more. We have
So a little on what Jaden had said, how it relates to the first reading. I agree with that because the first reading, it had like the 36 instructions, while in this reading, it had a list of principles and morals. And I believe it was Tanya that mentioned something about religion, which I could agree because when I was reading the part 2 of the passage where it says like, I have not done wrong to the people. When I was reading that passage, I instantly thought of like the 10 Commandments and like the religions and how they could connect. And then I believe this quote is like in the beginning of the passage, but where it says the ideal of knowledge that is said to love of science and aspiration for knowledge, and more precisely for the knowledge of true being, that which is true, certain, the moral of ideal of truth, justice, and rectitude, and the metaphysical ideal of love and knowledge of being, which is at the beginning of all being. Basically, from what I understood from that passage was that no matter the type of knowledge, it all comes from like a beginning.
Yeah. And then true, also Maria, like of true being, right? Like that's very profound, right? So the not for the knowledge. Hold on, I'm gonna read the whole passage because you bring up a really good point. A, the ideal of knowledge, that is to say, the love of science, the aspiration of knowledge, and more precisely, for the knowledge of true being, right? So really what that's saying is you're gathering this science, you're gathering this knowledge to truly be yourself, to be your true, purest version of yourself, right? And if you think back to last week's reading, and this notion of always follow your heart, right? And wealth will bring gloom. This is kind of speaking to that in my interpretation, right? Because following your heart is going to lead you to your true being, right? I asked you guys, I believe it was last week, what is your favorite characteristic or attribute, right? I asked you that so you can kind of get a sense of who your true being is, right? Because that's the goal. And when we get into next week's reading, it's going to pick this conversation right back up. So I know we have one more person to Fishbowl, so I'll let them go and they'll open up to class conversation.
I wanted to read like a quote from the reading. MAAT is first of all an ontological concept, but its ethical implications loom just as large on the ancient Egyptian intellectual horizon. And what I got from that is that MAAT has many principles that are known and followed, but the ethical implications of it has more of an impact or like consequences because there are many ideas and categories to it, making it very conceptual.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. So that was a really good Fishbowl, you guys. You guys brought up a lot of good points that we could carry on to our class conversation. One thing I do want to do, because I believe it was Maria who brought up the religious implications and the 10 Commandments. So let's deal with the 42 Confessions for a moment. And then we're going to talk about the similarities and the differences between the 42 Confessions of MAAT and the 10 Commandments. So I'm going to read a few of these confessions, right? I have not done wrong to people. I have not impoverished my family or friends. I have not done wrong instead of right. I have not known that which does not exist. So this is how the 42 confessions are phrased, right? I have not. And then they'll go into the confession. I have not. Confession. Somebody state for me how the 10 commandments are phrased.
You shall not.
You shall not, or thou shalt not, right? What's the distinction between those two phrasings? I have not, you shall not, or thou shalt not.
One is preventative, like saying you shall not do this.
Yep.
And then one is definitive, where it's saying I did not do this.
Absolutely. There's also a temporal analysis to that too, right? I have not is past tense, right? Thou shall not is future tense, is warning you what not to do. Okay? So these are some of the distinctions between the 42 Confessions of Ma'at and the 10 Commandments. It is argued, and I tend to believe this argument, that the 10 Commandments derived from the 42 Confessions of Ma'at. If anybody knows the history of Moses, Moses was trained within the Kemetic mystery schools. He spent a great amount of time in Egypt or in Kemet, and he learned the science of the great Kemetics, right? Then he comes to present us with the 10 Commandments. So historically, we know that these confessions predate the 10 Commandments. But also, when we talked about last week, and we can tie this conversation to last week's conversation, right? The commandments give you come from the basic instructions before leaving Earth, right? This is more aligned with the instructions of Ptah-hotep, who will teach you on how to live while here on Earth, right? And you hear that in the distinction between the commandments and the confessions. Because I have not done wrong, that means I've lived my whole life and I haven't wronged anyone. And I can state that with confidence, right? Juxtaposed to being told what not to do. You better not kill or else you're going to hell. You better not covet your neighbor's wife or else you're going to hell, right? So here's where these confessions come to play in a spiritual practice, right? Let me see if I have this up still. 1 second, you guys. All right. Okay. So, what happens? So I'm gonna get to your question right now, Shalama. So what happens is so for those who understand like the Catholic tradition, right, this idea of purgatory, right? So you make your transition, you're not yet in hell, you're not yet in heaven, you're kind of waiting to see what happens. The Kemetics had the same type of understanding. But what happens in their version of purgatory, you go before the Anubis, you go before the goddess Ma'at, and you go through the 42 confessions, and you state to Ma'at, I have not done wrong, I have not stolen, etc., etc., etc. While you state these confessions, your heart and a feather are resting on a scale. And if you state these confessions truly, then your heart will be lighter than the feather, and you'll be able to successfully navigate to the afterlife, or what we understand in Western religion, you'll make it to heaven, right? If you state the confessions and you're not able to state it truthfully, then your heart will not be as light as a feather. It will be heavier than the feather, and you're not able to transition to the afterlife. Here's a physical depiction of what I just described. So can everybody see this image here where my cursor is? I can't see, so just shout out if you can.
Yes.
Okay, bet.
Yes.
So if you notice right here, the Anubis, the little dog-looking thing on his knees, if you notice on one scale is the feather, the other scale is the heart, right? This individual, the first individual in white, is stating the 42 confessions of Ma'at. Here, if you can see my cursor, is Ma'at in a bird-shaped form. And we have Tahuti jotting down the 42 confessions. And again, if your heart, and it looks like this individual's heart is lighter than that feather, then then that individual will be able to make it to the afterlife. If your heart is heavier than the feather, and you're not able to successfully state the 42 confessions, then this jackal character here will take you, take your spirit or take your ka away, right? Here's another image. And it's kind of depicting the same thing. So that's kind of the practical, spiritual implications of these 42 confessions and how they would play out from a spiritual sense. So yeah, definitely we can relate this to the 10 Commandments. But I think the intentionality behind this and what it's set to do is a little bit different, because these are stated, after you've already made your transition. Like, I lived my entire life and I have not done any of these things. And I can say this with confidence, which will allow me to make my transition to the afterlife. Other questions, comments, or concerns about the reading, we can open up to class discussion.
I guess I'll add a question.
Sure.
So I wanted to include this. They say that God is floating over the waters, but doesn't it say in the Christian Bible that He creates the waters? So what is its true origin? God being existent within a dark void, floating over the waters, or God being in existence along with the darkness of the void, then creating the waters? Because in the readings, it says that God is in like the void before like existence itself, and he's floating over the waters, and then he decides to create everything. But yet in the Christian Bible and their teachings, they say that God was always in a non-existent dark void, and then he creates everything. So I thought it was a good question to bring that up and see the comparisons and see what come up with.
I agree, Jesse. That's a great question. I have what I would think is the answer, and I have how I would situate this answer. But I'm curious to hear what others think. So how do you guys reconcile that seeming contradiction between how the Cometics articulate their origin story and how Christianity articulates its origin story?
Personally,
Gotcha.
sorry.
Go ahead.
So I was gonna jump in and say I feel like this kind of goes back to this concept of elasticity, and more so in the sense of the fact that I feel like not everything can have exactly an exact meaning, and at the same time, something can also like kind of like the concept of something can be muddled. So I mean, they might not be separate things in the same sense. It could be just explaining the same thing, but I mean, you can only like infer.
Yeah, I like that. Mac, you were gonna say something?
Yeah, well, in this context, at least in the way you phrase the question, I would say it has to do with the perceptions of how each culture or I guess religion perceives God to begin with, where Christians see him more as he's the beginning, the ultimate supreme, and has always existed even before anything has existed and was the first creation, I guess, or the first existence, I guess. And now, I guess the Kemet see it, it's been more like they're kind of with the universe and existed at the same time, simultaneously with the nothingness, and then create the nothingness, and then create the universe, I guess.
Yeah. Tanaya?
When I think about his question, the first thing that comes to mind is how, because I took what was it, AP Euro, and you know that whole section where it's teaching you like the Puritans and the Calvinists and the Jesuits and stuff like that. They all had different Bibles to write about who God was, what his intentions, what his teachings were. So I just think in terms of the Bible that we all know today, it very well could have just been rewritten to ensure that God was the creator of all things, even if he wasn't. And me personally, I'm a Christian. I believe in God 100%. But I also know that we as people will change things to fit a narrative that we've created within society. Because Lord knows, if someone were to say, okay, God created most things, but he didn't create this, millions would just lose their mind. They just wouldn't be able to handle it. So to ensure that there's this same sense of understanding and like to alleviate, well, what they thought would be chaos, what actually created confusion, they created this image of God through the Bible that ensures, okay, he did everything. So you don't have to worry about anybody else helping because I'm telling you that he did everything, even though I don't even know for sure. And what was another thing? I think just in Egypt, their first encounters with God were, I feel like those would be more realistic actually, because it's kind of like these people being the first people, they have no reason to lie. Who are they lying to? Their civilization being, in a sense, isolated from other people, then they don't really have a reason to try and create this image of God that isn't what they learned through research, through understanding, through the signs that he was sending to the earth. We don't know, we weren't there. So I don't know, I think that's more so what it is. It's not necessarily that the Bible's wrong or the ancient writings of Kemet are wrong. It's more so people change things to fit a narrative that they want to push.
So Jesse, how do you feel about the responses that you received in regards to your question?
I think for me, this one's kind of tough just because I don't think there's exactly like I just kind of wanted to hear the feedback and see like what other people thought. But for me, I don't think I think what Tanya said was right. Like it's not too important about how things were created. I just think it's interesting seeing the different interpretations of it for me.
Yeah, I agree, and really, no, don't trip. You good? You ain't talk too long. You just made some accurate, valid points. But for me, and that's the reason why I chose not to say anything, because really what all three of y'all said encapsulates what I was going to say, and I think you articulated it perfectly. And that's why oftentimes your peers have better answers than what I have. I was looking at the chat. Jaden, you have me rolling, bro, because I didn't see when it came up. I only seen the first half of your text. You said all it read for me was "we and homosexuality are great," and I'm like, bro, what the fuck? But when I opened it up, it had a lot more to it, and I got you. But you're right; those are great examples, right? Yeah, and I think too. Here's another thing: making God the all-seeing, all-knowing, all creator, right? It takes the personal responsibility off of individuals, right? Because then you can say, well, God created this shit, this is how it's supposed to be. I'm just rolling with that, right? To where, to kind of understand this notion of God coexisting with the universe, right? And not necessarily one creating the other. It allows your space in the world to be a little bit more affective, right? Like you have a little bit more onus, you have a little bit more power in your decision making, opposed to just saying that everything's is done according to God's will, right? And I also, for me, I can't help but to draw in the distinctions between the intentionality behind why the Bible was written, right? To give you these instructions so you can make it to heaven, juxtaposed to texts like these Kemetic texts, which are concerned with creating heaven on earth, right? It's not really concerned with this notion of do these things so you can do this, in the sense of heaven or hell. But we want to do these things so we could all have peace, we could all have harmony, we could all feel love, right? And a lot of that, to me, that distinction, fear draws that distinction, right? Because heaven or hell, that's driving fear, right? Hell is a fear driver, right? How I was taught, you go to this place, your skin burns off, the shit grows back, it burns off again, then it grows back and it burns off again. Like that's something to scare you, right? The lake of fire, right? But to say that I want to do this so we could all be in harmony, so we could all be in peace, so we could all experience this notion of love, that's not driven from fear, right? That's driven from love. So there's another distinction for me that I like to draw between those two intentionalities. What else? What other thoughts did you guys have from the readings?
This isn't exactly a question, but it's more so like a comparison that I found that I thought was interesting. And I think your notes on this kind of like expanded this idea more. But the idea of like universal domain and like totality of like order and existence, I felt like that was an interesting concept in the sense that like mathematically it makes sense. Like if you were to look at things like the Fibonacci sequence or like certain patterns that exist within nature, or like sequences that just show themselves over and over again, whether it be on a like microscopic or macroscopic level, like I thought that that was like an interesting concept, more so in the sense that like it always repeats itself, like there isn't any inconsistencies. So I just thought that was cool.
That's so profoundly deep, Jaden, because, and here's why. When you really study the ancient Cometics, what you know about them is that they studied nature, right? and they were very, very keen on science and mathematics. Hence the pyramids, right? Those are scientific and mathematical phenomena, right, that have not been duplicated in our existence. So that just lets you know that learn from nature, the mastery of science and mathematics, right, was something that were pillars within the Kemetic society. So for me, it's not beyond reason that this society would take into consideration these things like universal order and universal domain, because nature reflects these new universal domains. I don't know what the fuck the example that you just gave. I've never heard of that in my life, but from what I understand of it, it's a scientific or a mathematic component that reinstitutes or reinstills this universal domain, right? So I completely agree with you, and my knowing and my understanding of the things that were important to them echoes your claims, because it coincides, right? And then when you think about how they understood the universal domain, and then they applied that to the personal domain. So your personal life should be ordered in that same fashion, right? That becomes very profoundly generative for how to live your life. It's a very good point. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm looking at the chat. Tonight says it reminds me of last week when we discussed the differences and extremes of God, written by Europeans and the people of Egypt. The God depicted by Europeans is very extreme in his actions and strong in his words. And then further in today's society, the idea is pushed that it's better to be feared than to be loved. Yep. But Egypt's God is written as love, and as action on the world are actions of love and used to make people accountable. Yeah, it's true, and I think too, if you look at the climate, you look at the culture between Europeans and Kemetic people. That's why people were migrating to Kemet, right? Because of the weather, because of the culture, because of the harmony and the order of their society, right? And then they took that information and tried to rebuild it where they come from, right? That's why there's so many similarities between the Greco-Roman Empire and the Kemetic Empire, right? They try to reduplicate that reality. Let's talk a little bit more about these three domains and the interrelated, interactive, and mutually affective, right? And those three domains being the divine, the natural, and the social. How can that be beneficial to take into consideration the fact that God and nature and society are interrelated? Well, let's scale back. What does it mean that God, society, and nature are interrelated? What does that mean?
My bad. Can you say it one more time?
Yeah. So what does it mean that God, nature, and society are interrelated?
Oh, because they're all the same thing, pretty much.
They're all the
They're
same.
interconnected. They're all interconnected. Like, that's my thing about like the difference in Christianity and all that. So like the chemists that you said were very scientific. My thing about like the connection, because people perceive as science and God as two opposites, but really it's the same thing. Because science is really the study of the natural world, therefore God's world. So anything that science says would be true, would be therefore true of God. So I would say the connection of that, and then we base our society off of those principles of nature too. Even you see these buildings and structures, like when they're building buildings and architects, they say, hey, this is the strongest form. Like the pyramid is a strong form, it has a strong base, or this cube is a strong base. We see that in nature with rock formations and stuff like that. And we build our society kind of based off of nature, and I don't know, it's all like connected kind of.
Did y'all get that? I hope y'all grab what he said, because he just dropped some dimes on y'all right now. You're absolutely right, Mac. Right. So when you do things from societal standpoint, right, you're going to take the divine, you're going to take nature into consideration, right? So for example, in our world, right, there's no way that we would have things like global warming if we understood the interconnectedness of nature, God, and society, right? You're not going to do something that's going to harm nature to advance your society, because you know that's going to have vast implications on your society later on, right? So I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was agreeing with you. Yeah.
Yeah. So to have these three things connected becomes very useful for having a society that's an alignment, to have a society that's myotic, right? This becomes very useful. And so when you think about trying to translate these notions of ma'at in today's world, yes, there's a temporal difference, right? There's a great amount of time that's taken place between the ancient Kemetic times and our times now. But it can be done, right? I forgot who was saying that. Carlos, he was like, I can see these principles making me a better person, right? No bullshit. My household, my life, everything I do is structured on ma'at, right? When it's time for me to make a decision that of great significance, I will sit down, I will meditate, and I will look to see if what I choose to do is in alignment with the principles of ma'at. Is this decision truthful? Is this decision just? Is this decision harmonious? Is this decision in order, right? Is this decision balanced? Is it reciprocity? Is it propriety, right? This is how I structure my life. This is how I structure my household. Is my kids being raised in a way that is myotic, right? Do they understand the principles of truth, justice, harmony, balance, order, reciprocity, propriety, right? And because I know with kids, it's not about what you say, but what you do. Am I embodying the examples of ma'at so they can know what ma'at looks like through my actions, right? So I do believe that this is something that is very useful for our now, right? Regardless of what's going on around in our society and how our society is trying to inform us as to what's normal, right? One thing about white supremacy, or what I like to call white inferiority, because if you have to make someone else feel inferior to make yourself feel supreme, then you are in fact not supreme, right? One of the things about white inferiority, it will make things that are abnormal normal. They'll make things that are otherwise insane appear to be normative. Again, 40-hour work weeks, that's normal. You'll go to your job orientation and they'll fucking tell you that this is really your family because you're going to spend more time with us than you will with your family. And everybody in orientation will clap that shit up like it's the most, but nah, that is insane, right? But we've normalized that to fit the narrative of the Protestant work ethic. So what white supremacy, white inferiority has an uncanny ability to do is to make the unnatural natural, to make the insane normal, right? So to the point that we can't perceive a society based on truth, based on justice, based on harmony, based on order, based on reciprocity and propriety as something that could be. We'll come up with all the rationale in the world as to why this cannot be the moral compass of our society. Instead of saying, you know what, how we're living is fucked up. We fucked it off. We need to rectify. We need to course correct. And it's funny how history has provided us a ideal principle to course correct. But our reality, our minds cannot perceive that as being functional. It's beyond normal. It's beyond reason, right?
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
So, I'm not from this country, but I was just wondering, would you say that that's like a product of like long-term conditioning, like the 40-hour work weeks and everything, like across like several decades and whatnot?
Absolutely. And it starts right with you look at the ebbs and flows of the economic production of the country, right? Let's talk about how the economics of this country started, enslavement, right? So it wasn't even about a 40-hour work week. Your black ass worked from sun up to sundown under the crack of my whip, right? So that's the first line of production from an economic standpoint. Then the Industrial Revolution comes in, right? So that's going to change the way that works. In the midst of that transition, we have this notion of the Protestant work ethic. So you're going to work in your fields and work in the harvest, right, to make sure that you have food to eat. And the more that you work, the more that your family will have. right? So they took these notions of work and applied it to the corporate understanding of work, right? Then you go into things like Wall Street, where it's not even about a 40-hour work week, it's about an 80-hour work week. And if you're not doing overtime, then you're not going to survive within this industry, right? This is the culture of Wall Street, right? So they manipulated these things and allowed it to suit the benefit of the business owners, right? Because that 40-hour work week that you're doing, while you're getting paid $20, $25, whatever the case may be, the owner of the company is getting all the means of that production, right?
And this all goes back to that concept of like capitalism and like material wealth and all that.
Yep.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I got it.
And to me, this is so, we're so, let me ask y'all, do you ever see a system in our society where enslavement comes back? Where enslavement is a system that is authenticated again? Do you ever see that being a reality?
Yes.
Like the prison system.
It already is.
Yep, you're all right. You're absolutely right. So we have the prison system. That's legalized enslavement, right? Here's another one that y'all may not be aware of. Have you ever heard the concept wage slavery?
Yeah.
Explain to us what wage slavery is, Matt.
Wage slavery essentially, it's like what slavery was. You work these hard hours, but you get paid a certain say for how many hours you work, right?
Yep. And what happens is, oh shit, I'm sorry, y'all. We hella over time. We'll say that for next week. Hey, y'all, somebody tell me like, yo, bro, you tripping? Let me show you what your next reading is, and we'll call it a day.